As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a soft golden glow over the lush gardens of a historic savanna estate, everything seemed perfect. The warm southern air was filled with the scent of blooming magnolias, the laughter of wedding guests, and the soft notes of a string quartet playing in the background. It was the kind of evening that seemed too good to be true, one where love, happiness, and joy were at their peak. But as we all know, appearances can be deceiving. Susan, radiant in her elegant white gown, stood at the edge of the garden, her heart pounding with a mix of excitement and nervousness. This was her day. The day she had waited for her whole life, the day she would marry Emanuel, the man who had swept her off her feet and promised her forever. Yet, as she prepared to walk down the aisle, something gnawed at her deep inside, a feeling she couldn't quite shake. It wasn't the usual pre-wedding jitters. No, this was something darker, something far more sinister. Emanuel, standing tall at the altar, looked every bit the perfect groom. His smile was wide, his charm undeniable, and the guests were captivated by his presence. But if you looked closely, really closely, you might notice something in his eyes. A flicker of doubt? A hint of guilt? Whatever it was there, hiding behind that bright smile. Emanuel loved Susan, or at least he told himself that. But as the wedding day arrived, his mind couldn't help but wander to someone else. Someone standing just a few feet away from his bride. Victoria, Susan's best friend, stood in her bridesmaid's dress, smiling softly as she watched her closest friend about to walk down the aisle. But behind that smile, there was something else, a hidden emotion. Envy? Regret? Maybe even desire. Susan and Victoria had been inseparable since childhood, like sisters. They had shared everything, dreams, secrets, and now, it seemed, even the love of the same man. The guests sat in their chairs, blissfully unaware of the emotional storm brewing just beneath the surface. To them, this was a fairy tale wedding, perfect in every way. But as the ceremony began, with vows exchanged and rings placed on fingers, an unspoken tension thickened in the air. A fleeting glance between Emanuel and Victoria, a glance Susan almost missed, hinted at something far darker than anyone could have imagined. For a split second, Susan hesitated as she stood at the altar, her hand resting in Emanuel's. A brief look of confusion crossed her face, as if she had caught something out of place. But she pushed the thought aside, telling herself it was just her nerves. This was her wedding day, after all. Everything had to be perfect. But sometimes it's those fleeting moments, those barely noticeable signs, that are the most dangerous. As the night fell and the reception began, the celebration seemed to grow louder and brighter, but beneath the surface, secrets were beginning to bubble up. Emanuel and Victoria shared more than just polite smiles. Their stolen glances across the dance floor, the quick, hidden touches, all spoke of something far deeper and far more dangerous. And though Susan was caught up in the excitement of her wedding day, those small moments were starting to add up in her mind. A growing sense of unease began to creep into her thoughts. What Susan didn't know, what no one knew, was that Emanuel and Victoria had been involved for months. What began as innocent flirtation had quickly spiraled into a full-blown affair. And now, on the night that was supposed to be about the union of Emanuel and Susan, the truth was lurking in the shadows, waiting to be exposed. Victoria had always wanted more than just friendship from Emanuel, and as the affair deepened, she had become more and more desperate to claim him as her own. And Emanuel? He was torn between the woman he had promised to marry and the one who stirred something deep inside him, a craving for excitement and danger. Susan, for all her grace and strength, was no fool. She could feel something shifting in Emanuel, even if she couldn't quite place it. His sudden need for privacy, the way he quickly pulled his hand away from hers during the wedding vows, the fact that he had been acting distant for weeks leading up to the wedding, it all started to weigh on her. The feeling of unease that had begun earlier in the evening was now turning into full-fledged suspicion. And as the night wore on, Susan found herself watching Emanuel more closely than she had ever done before. Every laugh he shared with Victoria, every moment they were too close, too comfortable, it all started to form a picture she didn't want to see. But the truth has a way of revealing itself, no matter how hard we try to ignore it. The celebration continued late into the night. Guests danced, drank, and laughed, blissfully unaware of the storm that was brewing just beneath the surface. But in the quiet corners of that beautiful garden, something far more dangerous was happening. But Susan was smarter than that. She had caught him before he could make his move, and now she held all the cards. With Jessica's help, she began quietly transferring the money out of the accounts, siphoning it away before Emanuel even realized what was happening. The day of reckoning was fast approaching, and Susan could feel the weight of it pressing down on her. Emanuel and Victoria had no idea what was coming. The night before Susan planned to confront them, she stood in front of the mirror, staring at her reflection. She looked calm, composed, but inside she was a storm of emotions. She had spent weeks preparing for this moment, but now that it was almost here, she felt a flicker of doubt. Could she really go through with it? Could she really destroy the man she had once loved? But then she thought about the betrayal, the lies, the humiliation. And just like that, the doubt disappeared, replaced by a cold, steely resolve. Tomorrow, everything would change. Emanuel and Victoria thought they had won, but they were wrong. Tomorrow, they would lose everything. The morning of the confrontation, Susan felt a strange sense of calm wash over her. She had spent so long preparing for this moment, but now that it was here, it felt almost surreal. Emanuel and Victoria were still completely unaware of what was coming, and that gave her a twisted sense of satisfaction. They had underestimated her, both of them, thinking she would fall apart once she discovered the affair. They expected her to break down, to be consumed by grief and anger. But they didn't know her as well as they thought. Susan was no victim. She had arranged to meet Emanuel at the house, pretending that they needed to have a serious discussion about their future. He had agreed, albeit hesitantly, sensing that something wasn't quite right. Susan could see the suspicion in his eyes when he left that morning, but he hadn't questioned her. He thought he was in control. That was his mistake. As she dressed for the meeting, Susan chose a simple black dress, one that gave her an air of quiet authority. She wanted to look strong, composed, someone who couldn't be broken. She applied her makeup carefully, her expression cold and determined as she studied her reflection in the mirror. By the time she arrived at the house, Emanuel was already there, pacing nervously in the living room. He looked up when she entered, a faint smile playing on his lips, but it didn't reach his eyes. Then came the moment that would change everything. Susan had stepped away to catch her breath, overwhelmed by the day's events. But when she returned to the reception, she saw something that stopped her in her tracks, a sight that shattered the perfect image of her wedding day. Emanuel and Victoria, standing too close, their bodies almost touching. And then, the kiss. It was quick, barely noticeable, but it was there. The kiss that confirmed everything Susan had been dreading. Her heart raced, her breath quickened, and for a moment time seemed to stand still. The music, the laughter, the lights, everything faded into the background. All that existed in that moment was the betrayal unfolding before her eyes. Susan's world began to crumble as the image of that kiss burned itself into her mind. Her hands trembled, her heart pounded louder than the music, and the edges of her vision blurred with shock and betrayal. This couldn't be real on her wedding day, no less. She had fought for everything in her life, worked her way up, survived heartbreaks, disappointments, and setbacks, only to have it all unravel in a single moment. She didn't know how long she stood there, frozen, watching Emanuel and Victoria in their stolen moment. But what came next was a surge of anger so intense, it nearly knocked her off her feet. The betrayal from her best friend, her husband, was enough to ignite something in Susan that had been buried for years, a rage that she had kept hidden behind her calm and composed exterior. Her mind raced. Confront them now? Expose the affair in front of the entire wedding party? No, Susan knew better. She had spent her whole life playing things smart, keeping her emotions in check. No one would ever see her fall apart. Not here, not tonight. Instead, she turned on her heel and walked away from the reception, her face a perfect mask of calm. She needed time to think, to plot her next move. The betrayal cut deep, but it wasn't going to break her. Not yet. In the distance, the music played on, oblivious to the turmoil swirling just beyond the dance floor. The guests, still lost in the celebration, clinked their glasses, toasted the newlyweds, and danced under the stars, unaware of the storm that was gathering. Meanwhile, Emanuel and Victoria, now fully aware that they had been caught, exchanged a panicked look. Victoria's breath hitched, her heart racing. She had wanted Emanuel, yes, but not like this, not with the fear of being exposed hanging over their heads. Emanuel, on the other hand, seemed lost in his thoughts, torn between the thrill of his affair with Victoria and the crushing reality of what he had done to his wife. As the night wore on, the tension between the three of them became unbearable. Susan, now back at the reception but keeping her distance, watched Emanuel's every move. She saw how he fidgeted, how his eyes darted nervously from her to Victoria and back again. The weight of the secret was crushing him, and it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. But Susan wasn't ready to explode, at least, not yet. She had something far more calculated in mind. She wasn't going to lose Emanuel to Victoria. No, if anyone was going to end this marriage, it was going to be her. But not before making sure both of them paid for what they had done. She needed time to figure out how to confront them, how to expose their lies without destroying herself in the process. Then, almost like fate, a plan began to form in her mind. Emanuel had been hiding more than just his affair with Victoria. In the weeks leading up to the wedding, Susan had noticed strange behavior: missed meetings, long phone calls he quickly ended when she walked into the room, a sudden increase in the amount of cash he was withdrawing from their joint account. It didn't take much for her to figure out that he was hiding something. But now, in light of his affair, it all made sense. Emanuel wasn't just cheating on her with Victoria, he was involved in something much darker. Susan needed proof. Proof that would not only expose the affair but bring down Emanuel in a way that would ensure he could never hurt her again. And as for Victoria, well, she had plans for her too. That night, as the wedding reception wound down and the guests began to leave, Susan slipped away. She needed space, and more importantly, she needed to think. She would confront Emanuel in the morning after she had everything she needed to bring him and Victoria to their knees. Susan didn't sleep that night. She lay awake in their hotel suite, the glow of the city lights outside casting a faint reflection on the ceiling. Emanuel, lying next to her, was fast asleep, oblivious to the storm that was brewing inside her. His chest rose and fell steadily, his face peaceful, as though he hadn't just destroyed everything they had built together. Susan stared at him in the darkness, her mind churning. How long had this affair been going on? How many lies had he told her? She clenched her fists under the sheets, fighting the urge to shake him awake and confront him right then and there. But no, that would be too easy, too predictable. Emanuel expected her to fall apart, to be the heartbroken wife who would cry and scream. But Susan was determined to be smarter than that. She was going to make him pay. Her thoughts turned to Victoria, the woman who had stood by her side as a bridesmaid, smiling and laughing as if everything was perfect. The betrayal stung even more because of how close they had been. Victoria had been her confidante, her best friend. But now she was just another enemy in Susan's mind, and enemies, Susan knew, had to be dealt with carefully. The next morning, Susan watched as Emanuel stirred beside her, slowly waking up. His eyes fluttered open, and for a brief moment he smiled at her, completely unaware of the war raging in her mind. It took everything in her not to slap that smile off his face. "Morning," he mumbled, stretching lazily. "Morning," Susan replied, forcing a smile that felt like it might crack her face in two. She needed to keep up the facade a little longer. She needed time. As Emanuel got up and headed for the shower, Susan's mind raced. She had to act fast, but she couldn't afford any mistakes. She reached for her phone and quickly texted her lawyer, setting up a meeting for later that afternoon. If Emanuel was hiding something, money, assets, whatever it was, she would find out. And when she did, she'd use it to destroy him. Once Emanuel was in the shower, Susan quietly slipped out of bed and grabbed his phone from the nightstand. She had never been one to invade his privacy before, but things were different now. She knew there had to be something on his phone: texts, emails, anything that would prove what he and Victoria had been doing behind her back. Her fingers trembled as she scrolled through his messages. And then, there it was, a string of texts between Emanuel and Victoria, detailing their affair in explicit detail. Her stomach churned as she read them, her hands shaking with fury. They had been meeting for months, sneaking around behind her back while she had been planning their wedding. The betrayal cut deeper than she had imagined. Susan felt a wave of nausea hit her as she saw how cavalier they had been about it, joking about how easy it had been to keep the affair hidden from her. The texts were filled with promises of a future together, of how they could finally be free after the wedding. Susan's breath quickened, her vision blurring with rage. They had planned to humiliate her, to make her the fool. But now, armed with the truth, she would make sure they paid for it. By the time Emanuel stepped out of the shower, Susan had already composed herself, slipping his phone back where it belonged. She smiled at him, her expression unreadable, while her mind worked at lightning speed. Later that afternoon, Susan sat across from her lawyer in a sleek downtown office. The air was thick with tension as she laid everything out: the affair, the financial discrepancies, and her plan to expose Emanuel and Victoria. Her lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Jessica, nodded as she listened, taking notes and offering advice. "We can absolutely investigate his finances," Jessica said, her tone calm but focused. "But we need to be careful. If he's hiding something, he's probably already taken steps to cover his tracks. It's not going to be easy." "I don't care how hard it is," Susan replied, her voice steady. "I want him to pay for what he's done. And I want Victoria to suffer too. She's just as guilty as he is." Jessica leaned back in her chair, studying Susan carefully. "You're sure about this? Once we start digging, there's no going back. This could get ugly." Susan's eyes hardened. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." Over the next few days, Susan carefully put her plan into motion. She played the part of the perfect wife, all smiles and sweetness, while behind the scenes, she gathered every piece of evidence she could find. Emanuel had no idea what was coming. The tension between him and Victoria grew with each passing day. They were both on edge, constantly looking over their shoulders, fearing that their secret would be exposed. But Susan remained calm, biding her time, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. She watched as Emanuel became more distracted, more nervous. He was hiding something bigger than just the affair. And Susan was determined to find out what it was. Her suspicions were confirmed when Jessica uncovered a series of offshore accounts in Emanuel's name. He had been funneling money into these accounts for months, preparing to run off with Victoria and leave Susan with nothing. Victoria's hands trembled as she opened the folder, her eyes scanning the contents in disbelief. "Susan, please," she whispered, her voice cracking. "You can't do this." "Oh, I can," Susan said, standing up and grabbing her bag. "And I will." As Susan walked out of the cafe, leaving Victoria in stunned silence, she felt a sense of finality settle over her. The revenge was complete. She had taken everything from both of them. Emanuel was ruined, and now Victoria would face the consequences of her betrayal. But as she got into her car and drove away, the same hollow feeling returned. She had won, but the victory felt empty. The life she had once known was gone, and no amount of revenge could bring it back. "What's this about, Susan?" he asked, trying to sound casual, but his voice was tight with tension. Susan didn't answer right away. Instead, she calmly set her bag down on the coffee table and sat across from him, crossing her legs and folding her hands in her lap. "We need to talk," she said finally, her tone measured. "There are some things I've discovered recently, things I think you should know about." Emanuel's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, Susan saw a flicker of real fear cross his face. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice now tinged with a hint of panic. "I know about the affair, Emanuel," she said bluntly, watching as the blood drained from his face. "I know about you and Victoria." Emanuel froze, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to find the right words. But before he could say anything, Susan continued, her voice sharp and cold. "I also know about the offshore accounts," she said, leaning forward slightly. "I know you've been funneling money away, planning to run off with her and leave me with nothing." Emanuel's face twisted in shock and disbelief. "What? Susan, I don't know what you're—" "Don't lie to me," Susan snapped, her voice rising. "I have all the evidence, Emanuel. Every transaction, every message. Do you really think I'm that stupid?" He fell silent, his hands trembling as he realized the full extent of what she knew. He was trapped, and there was no way out. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The room was thick with tension, the weight of the betrayal hanging between them like a storm cloud. Finally, Emanuel let out a long breath, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "Susan, I never meant for it to get this far," he said quietly, his voice filled with regret. "I was going to tell you, I swear, but I didn't know how." Susan laughed bitterly, shaking her head. "You didn't know how. You were planning to leave me for my best friend and steal everything we built together. Don't pretend this was some kind of mistake." Emanuel lowered his head, unable to meet her eyes. He had no defense left, no excuses to offer. He had been caught, and there was no way to undo what he had done. But Susan wasn't finished yet. "I've already taken the money out of your accounts," she said calmly, watching as his head snapped up in shock. "Every penny you hid, I've moved it. You have nothing, Emanuel, nothing." He stared at her, his eyes wide with disbelief. You can't do that," he stammered. That's illegal." Susan smiled, a cold, calculating smile that sent a shiver down Emanuel's spine. "It's already done," she said simply, "and there's nothing you can do about it." Emanuel was speechless, his world crumbling around him. Everything he had worked for, everything he had planned, it was all gone. Susan stood up, grabbing her bag and turning toward the door. But before she left, she turned back to him, her eyes flashing with anger and satisfaction. "You deserve everything that's coming to you," she said quietly. "I hope you enjoy your new life, Emanuel, because it's all downhill from here." With that, she walked out of the house, leaving Emanuel standing there, stunned and broken. Susan didn't stop to catch her breath until she was safely in her car. The door slammed shut behind her. Her hands were shaking, her heart racing, but she felt a strange sense of exhilaration. She had won. She had taken control, and she had destroyed him. But the victory felt hollow. As she drove away, the weight of what she had done began to settle on her shoulders. She had spent so much time planning her revenge, so much time focused on making Emanuel and Victoria pay, that she hadn't stopped to think about what came next. What was left for her now? The thought nagged at her as she drove, the adrenaline from the confrontation slowly fading. She had won the battle, but at what cost? And then there was Victoria. Susan hadn't dealt with her yet, but that was a problem for another day. Susan's thoughts turned dark as she drove. The anger that had fueled her confrontation with Emanuel was still burning, but now it was laced with something else, a deeper, colder rage directed at Victoria. The betrayal cut even deeper, because Victoria hadn't just been her best friend, she had been like a sister. They had shared everything. Every secret, every dream, every struggle. And now Victoria had taken the one thing that mattered most. As the wheels of her car sped down the empty highway, Susan made a decision. She wasn't done yet. Emanuel had suffered, but Victoria needed to face the consequences too. She wasn't going to walk away from this without feeling the pain of her actions. Susan's mind raced, formulating a plan, a way to confront Victoria that would leave no doubt as to who had the upper hand. Susan spent the next few days meticulously laying the groundwork for her next move. She gathered every piece of dirt she could find on Victoria. In this digital age, secrets were hard to keep, and Victoria had plenty. From the affair with Emanuel to hidden financial dealings that could ruin her professionally, Susan uncovered it all. The more she dug, the more it became clear that Victoria had been living a double life, just like Emanuel. But Susan didn't just want to expose her. She wanted to hurt her, to make her feel the full weight of the betrayal. It wasn't enough to reveal the affair. Susan wanted to strip Victoria of everything, to take away the life she had stolen from her. The opportunity came sooner than Susan expected. Victoria, oblivious to the storm brewing around her, had reached out to Susan. She wanted to meet, to talk, no doubt feeling guilty about what had happened, but not enough to confess the truth. Susan agreed. She needed to face Victoria head-on. It was the only way to truly make her suffer. They met at a small cafe on the edge of town. It was quiet, tucked away from the usual hustle and bustle. Victoria arrived first, sitting nervously at a table in the corner. Her eyes darted around the room, as if she expected to be recognized, exposed. Susan watched her from outside for a moment, observing the tension in her posture, the way she fidgeted with her phone. When she finally walked in, Victoria looked up, her face a mix of relief and guilt. "Susan," she said softly, standing to greet her. "I wasn't sure you'd come." Susan forced a smile, her stomach churning with disgust. "Of course," she replied, keeping her voice even. "We need to talk." They sat across from each other, the tension between them palpable. Susan let Victoria squirm for a few moments, enjoying the discomfort on her face. "I wanted to apologize," Victoria began, her voice shaking slightly. "I know things have been complicated, but I want to fix this. I don't want to lose you." Susan raised an eyebrow, feigning surprise. "Fix this? What exactly do you want to fix, Victoria?" Victoria hesitated, her hands trembling as she reached for her coffee. I know things between you and Emanuel have been hard lately, and I hate that I've been caught in the middle. I want to be there for you to help you both through this." Susan's eyes narrowed. The audacity of her words made her blood boil. But she remained calm, her voice cold as ice. "Caught in the middle," she repeated, leaning forward slightly. "Is that what you think this is?" Victoria's eyes flickered with confusion. "Susan, I know about the affair," Susan interrupted, her voice sharp. "I know about everything. You and Emanuel, the lies, the deceit." Victoria's face went pale. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. "I've seen the messages," Susan continued, her voice rising. "I know about the hotel meetings, the trips you took together. I know you've been plotting behind my back for months, so don't sit there and pretend you're innocent." Victoria's hands flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. "Susan, I never meant for this to happen." "But it did," Susan snapped, her voice filled with venom. "You betrayed me, Victoria. You betrayed our friendship, our sisterhood. For what? A fling with my husband. Was it worth it?" Tears welled up in Victoria's eyes as she shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. "I didn't want to hurt you." Susan laughed bitterly, shaking her head. "You didn't want to hurt me? Well, guess what? You did, and now it's your turn to feel the pain." With that, Susan slid a folder across the table. Inside were all the details she had uncovered, evidence of the affair, of Victoria's shady financial dealings, everything that could destroy her both personally and professionally. The cafe's dim lights faded in the distance as Susan drove away, but the weight of her actions pressed heavily on her chest. The rush of adrenaline from confronting Victoria was quickly dissolving, leaving her with an unsettling hollowness. She had destroyed the lives of the two people who had hurt her most, but the victory felt like ashes in her mouth. In that moment, Susan understood the true cost of betrayal. It wasn't just the pain of being wronged by those she trusted. It was the destruction of everything she had ever believed in, everything she had fought for. And now, as she sat alone in the quiet, she realized that revenge, while satisfying in the moment, had ultimately left her more broken than before. Her thoughts spiraled as the road stretched out ahead. What had she really won? Emanuel was gone, their marriage in ruins, and Victoria, once her closest friend, was shattered. The betrayal had run so deep that no amount of revenge could heal the wounds they had left behind. A cold chill ran through her as she realized the full extent of the damage. She was truly alone now. Her marriage had crumbled, her friendship lay in tatters, and her heart, once full of love and trust, was consumed by darkness. As she pulled up to her home, the once comforting warmth of the place now felt like a tomb. The silence was deafening. She stepped inside, the sound of her footsteps echoing through the empty house. Every picture on the wall, every piece of furniture, reminded her of the life she had lost. She sank onto the couch, staring at her phone. Emanuel's number stared back at her from the screen, a final reminder of the man she had once loved. A part of her wanted to call him, to hear his voice one last time, but she knew it was over. There was no going back. Susan's eyes filled with tears, the emotional weight of everything finally breaking through. Her chest tightened as the sobs came, her body shaking with the force of her grief. She had sought revenge, and she had gotten it. But in the process, she had lost herself. The finality of it all hit her like a tidal wave. There was no more fight, no more plans to make. Everything was done. Emanuel, Victoria, the life she had envisioned, it was all gone. She was left with nothing but the wreckage of what had once been her world. As the tears subsided and the silence once again filled the room, Susan realized that she didn't know what came next. The revenge had consumed her, and now that it was over, there was nothing left. No future, no hope, just a void. The quiet of the night settled around her as she lay back, exhausted, defeated. The storm had passed, but the wreckage remained. And in the stillness, Susan finally accepted that she would have to rebuild from the ruins if that was even possible.